Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Elle Covington. So I am a research specialist librarian, and my specific focus is on advanced reviews, so systematic reviews, scoping reviews. And we're going to talk about research questions sort of broadly, and trying to get, across disciplines as well. But I am coming from a perspective of systematic and scoping reviews. So a lot of my examples are going to be systematic to scoping reviews. And my expertise is in sort of the social sciences as well. So as we go through, that's going to be my perspective. And I'm going to give you resources for other people to reach out to for other specializations too. But here's sort of the general outline plan is we're going to talk about what is a research question, what does it do? Aspects of a good research question, types of research questions, and then frameworks for helping you develop those research questions. And then I wanted to start with a couple of quotes here. This one at the top is one of my favorite ones. Fuzzy questions tend to lead to fuzzy answers. And that is sort of, I have that there to sort of talk about like the importance of really thinking through a research question and like how important it is to have a really idea of what you want to know up front before you try to like dig into the data and do any data analysis, because if you don't know what you're looking for, then it's really hard to find it, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And pairing that along with developing a research question is an interactive and inductive endeavor that takes place over time. And I do also want to really stress that too, is developing a good research question takes time, and it takes a lot of research to develop a good research question, right? Some of the sources say, plan like a third of your projects to be developing a good research question. So, when it comes to systematic and scoping reviews, that's one of those things that I'm always stressing is let's do some exploratory searching beforehand, and let's make sure that we have a good research question. Let's make sure that we have a research question that we can answer before we really get into this project, because we don't want to waste so much time realizing that like it's not possible to answer this research question, or we didn't really have a good idea of what that research question was to begin with. And then sort of, I really like this definition of what is a research question. It's an operationalization of the purposes to which your project aims, right? And then highlighting here, it allows for the appropriate research methods to be applied. And that's what we're really going to be hitting on in this workshop, is really matching your research question to those methods, because certain methods are going to be able to answer that research question, others may not. And then also guiding the entire design of your project. So thinking through that research question in advance is what sort of helps you develop the rest of the project around it. So further, a little bit more about what a research question does, details the problem statement, further describes and refines the issue under study, adds focus to the problem statement, guides data collection analysis, sets context of research, right? Sort of basically just getting a little bit more granular into what that definition told us. All of these things are going to be reliant on that research question. And then I want to add in specifically for advanced reviews, here are some things that I like to think about when developing a research question for my advanced reviews. My research question is really going to help me determine, is this a systematic review? Is this a scoping review? Is this a meta-analysis? Because all of those are going to answer different types of questions. And so we'll get a little bit more into that further along. It's going to help differentiate your review from previously published reviews. So along with that, you'll want to know what's been previously published as you're developing your research question. You don't want to ask exactly the same research question that somebody else has already asked and published on, but that can be a springboard for really helping you focus in on, okay, now I know this because I've read this paper. What questions do I still have? Or what questions does this paper bring up that I really want to focus in on, so that you can build on the research that's been conducted already. So informing your search terms, because of course with advanced reviews, that searching for sources is your data collection, right? It's so important. And so if you have that good, strong research question, you're going to draw a lot of your terms for your search strategy from that research question. And also where you're going to be searching for those sources. So what types of sources are going to be best? Is it going to be the academic published literature, or do you want to bring in some government reports or CDC reports or all of those kinds of things? That's going to dictate where you're searching for materials, as well as, what you're searching for and how you're searching for them. Your eligibility criteria are going to be built off of that research question as well. So what are you going to include and what are you going to exclude from all of these papers that you're finding? Will be informed by the research question. This one I'm pushing more and more at preventing scope creep, because the more scoping reviews specifically I'm involved in, the more we are discussing scope creep. And so scope creep can, when you're really excited about a research project, you're really excited about a topic, you want to know, you're finding all of this cool stuff. You want to do all of the things, and it can really lead to broadening out too much. And since scoping reviews by nature are broad, it's even more important to sort of like put those parameters around things. It's like, okay, I know that this is going to be broad anyway, so I need to make sure that within this project, this is what I'm focusing on. And so that research question will really help you kind of maintain those parameters and help you avoid scope creep. Because then you can always come back and say, as I'm doing with one of my research teams right now, we're constantly coming back and saying, okay, great question for the next paper, next paper, next paper, so that we can make sure that we get this one paper done and published. Informing the data analysis techniques that you're going to use, and also informing where to publish. And this is another thing that I like to really talk about up front with systematic and scoping reviews specifically. I think it's important for other methodologies as well, but specifically for systematic and scoping reviews, take a look at where you want to publish up front, because their requirements for how you're going to do these things are going to differ. So one of the first things I always ask is look for a target journal and then take a look at what they're publishing, and take a look at the quality and what their requirements are. And then, is your research question, is your methodology going to fit with the types of things that they publish? And that can sort of, it's, as sort of the definition and things that we've been talking about, it's an iterative process. And so your research question isn't going to be a one and done. It's going to be all of these things coming together, helping inform how I'm developing this based on what I'm finding and what I'm thinking through. So I thought that this might be a good exercise for us to do, is take this topic, impacts of climate change, and sort of think through how would we turn this into a research question as we're going through. And then if we have time at the end, maybe we can discuss sort of the ways that we were thinking about turning impacts of climate change into a research question. And I wanted to make this as like sort of an interdisciplinary thing as possible. So however you want to come at what types of impacts you're thinking about. So with that, so things to think about when we're developing this topic into a research question. There are a couple of different models here that I have outlined, but I do want to stress that there's no one formula for developing a research question. Take from this what is helpful, and some things might be helpful for some research questions and might not be for others, specifically for different types of methodology. So thinking about, here's the sample. This is from the Campbell collaboration. Campbell is sort of the one of the authorities in systematic reviews for the social sciences, specifically education, is some of their so a lot of the qualitative systematic work, like a lot of those guidelines are coming out of Campbell, and so they have this sample for developing your research question. So is your research question specific, answerable? Are there measurable constructs? Is it practical, logical, empirical? And that measurable constructs can be a little bit tricky. And so you might be operationalizing things in ways based on what the literature is finding. And especially when we're talking about qualitative data, sometimes how we're measuring things can get a little tricky, but that's why we want to really think about it up front. So along with developing a research question, I really advise defining the terms within that research question, and that will help you measure those things. So one, probably not the best example, but the one off the top of my head is like, what are we considering children? What is the age range there? Are we considering, grades, school grades? Is there a range in there? Is it, 0 to 18? Is it 5 to whatever, right? So like really thinking through those definitions of what we're considering each of these things, and how are we measuring them? And then there's another source over here, and I have a slide at the very end of this with all of my references. So you can go and read more about all of these things from that slide. So Finer Maps is the one in this Rattan, but Cochrane, which is the sort of the authoritative source for systematic reviews in the health sciences. They use just the Finer part of this. So again, use what's helpful for you. But thinking through your research question, is it feasible? Is it interesting? Is it novel? Is it ethical? Is it relevant? Is it manageable, appropriate? Potential value for publishability? Is my target journal going to want to publish this? And then is it systematic? And they're using the term systematic kind of broadly here. They're not just talking about systematic reviews. They're talking about, do you have a method for each stage in the project? And so your research question is going to inform that. So those are sort of some aspects that you can think about when developing a research question. Are there any questions from you at this point? All of this. Okay. Again, yeah, feel free to stop me at any point in time. So then thinking through a little bit more on types of research questions. And there's some really good sources that have broken this down into, the type of data. So qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. I really liked this sort of flow chart that they put together for this one for quantitative research questions. So the types of questions that you can answer are descriptive questions, comparative, and relationship questions, or correlative is another way that they talk about that relating. So describing, comparing things, and relating. And so like, how many variables are you thinking through, right? If you're just thinking about one variable, that's going to be a descriptive research question. We're describing a phenomenon. If it's 2 or more, that's when we're getting into, in advanced reviews terms, we're getting into those systematic reviews that have an intervention and a comparison, which we'll talk about those frameworks again in a minute, right? So are we comparing, or are we taking a look at the relationship between two things? And then when it comes to qualitative, and I'm not gonna, like, these are not comprehensive. These are sort of like examples and things that I've found in the literature. But don't think that these are the only types of questions that you can ask with these. But just to illustrate and give you an idea. So again, Discover, and one of the sources that I found had a really good, some methodologies within qualitative research that might be good for the different things. So Discover, grounded theory, explain ethnography, and then I would also say a systematic review is what I added to that. Explore, if you're just exploring a phenomenon, case study, or again, scoping review. That's a lot of scoping reviews are just exploratory in nature. That's kind of the biggest strength of a scoping review. Describing experiences, phenomenology, and I think you could do probably both a systematic and a scoping review, depending on sort of like how you're thinking through describing experiences, but I would say probably more of a systematic review, and then contextualizing events or interventions or phenomena. Okay, and then getting a little bit deeper into the advanced reviews and examples of the types of questions for quantitative, right? Did an intervention work? And that is the very typical, like, why systematic reviews were really developed is, did this intervention work? And is it better than this intervention or better than no intervention? So that is sort of the classic systematic review research question. But then sort of as we're branching out and thinking through, well, how can we bring some qualitative research into systematic reviews? How did that intervention work? So that is another type of research question, or how do people feel about an intervention? And how do people feel about a phenomenon? And so you'll notice that I sort of have systematic review for how do people feel about an intervention and scoping review for how do people feel about a phenomenon. And that is because of sort of the breadth of those types of things. We're still looking at a very specific intervention with a systematic review. And with a phenomenon, that's going to be much broader. And there might be a lot of different interventions or different aspects, different variables related to that phenomenon. And so that gets much broader. And so that's still a little bit exploratory in nature of like the phenomenon itself. So that's how I'm sort of thinking through that. And the next mixed methods, what is the nature of a phenomenon? That's very obviously scoping review. We're very exploratory at that point. Okay, and then a lot of these examples, again, are going to come from the health sciences because that's who's done a lot of work on advanced reviews and frameworks. But frameworks can be really helpful in developing your research question. And so I've got a couple of slides here with a couple of different frameworks. It's probably going to be overwhelming. So just know that you have these slides available, and these are here to help you. And if they are not helpful, you don't have to use them. But so here's a chart that's sort of talking about like the type of questions you might be asking, whether it's effectiveness, experiential, cost, economic, prevalence, or incidence. And then some of the frameworks that might be really good for developing a research question around those. And so the first one is PICO. That's the classic one for systematic reviews, population, intervention, comparators, outcomes. So that's, again, we're comparing two interventions to see which ones are effective. Lends itself really well to quantitative data. For qualitative, there's this sort of different PICO that we're looking at, which is population, phenomenon of interest, and context, right? And so that's sort of broader. And so we can think about, who's our population? What is this thing, this concept that we want to know about? And then what are the sort of contextual parameters that we want to put it in? And then developing that sort of into your research question. There's this POCOC, so adding context to PICO, and then COCOPOP, condition, context, population. And again, that's for like prevalence of a disease or a phenomenon or something along those lines. And then sort of another source on those, some of these are the same. You can see some other variations on PICO, and sort of another way of looking at it for the different disciplines. So which of these is going to lend itself best to your discipline? Not to say that you can't use some of these for other disciplines, but more along the lines of this is the disciplines for which these different frameworks were developed. So if you're working in the social sciences, something like SPICE or SPIDER or PEO, which is population exposure outcome, which I've got that on the next slide. But some of those lend themselves a little bit more to some more of that social sciences kind of contexts for things. And then sort of business and management as well. And then here is, sorry about this being sort of like rough and just a lot of things. I'm hoping to eventually develop this into a much better chart. And this is not all of the frameworks that are out there, but this is a good amount of them. So different ways of sort of thinking through, if one of these frameworks isn't working for you, will another one work for you? Or can you pull from different frameworks to help you develop your research question out of them? And some of them, I don't have it on here, but these again were developed for different disciplines. And so some of them will be much more applicable to certain disciplines than others will. And if you're interested in more about these and more about the sources of these, that is a chart that I'm developing. And if you email me if you're interested in one of these and want to know where does that one come from, where can I read more about that, let me know. Just email me and I can send you that source, because I didn't have space to just list all of the sources for each of these. Okay, and so then how do we use these? How do we take these frameworks and then develop them into a research question? So I've got a couple of examples here. So using that PEO, the population exposure outcomes, again, a lot of the social sciences, this can be used for either systematic or scoping reviews. Depending, I would say it probably lends itself a little bit more to a scoping review. But again, it sort of just depends on what is the research questions that you're building around it. And so a good example here is what impact does involvement in freshman learning communities, so that's our exposure, have on the success outcome of first generation college students? So we've got all of our different elements in there. We're still going to need to do some defining of what those concepts are. How are we measuring success, right? But that at least gives us a starting point to do that work. And I would say, you know, doing some of that definition is, to me, still part of developing your research question. Even though you may have this as your research question, we still want to think through what do we mean by these things. And I still consider that part of putting together a research question. And then for the quantitative, we're looking at that PICO again, that classic systematic review framework. Does participation in freshman learning communities, so that's our intervention, participation in the learning communities, have an effect on the GPA, right? So we've got a very specific outcome, whereas we had sort of success, and we would still need to figure out how to measure success. This is a very one specific way of measuring success. GPA of first generation college students, again, our population, compared to those who did not participate. So our comparator. Intervention versus no intervention. You might have this learning communities versus another intervention, and that would be another good systematic review research question, just depending on what research is out there, right? And how do you decide what that comparator is? And that is another thing that's one of the reasons that developing these research questions is really going to be iterative. So you're going to be looking in the literature to see if this is an answerable question. Maybe you come up with one comparator and there's just not enough literature out there, or there's not enough of the right type of methodology out there to compare it to the intervention that you want to compare it to, right? And we're trying to compare the same type of data with the same type of data in a systematic review. So if you're looking at case studies for one versus randomized controlled trials for the other, that's really hard to compare. And you're not necessarily going to know that until you dig into the literature. And so that's why, you know, this sort of exploratory searching as you're developing this research question is really helpful to make sure that your research question is going to be answerable. Or maybe you need to change it into a broader research question because that research doesn't exist. And then you change it from a systematic review to a scoping review. And you do that up front before you've really put in a lot of the work. All right. Any questions about that? I know that was a lot and a lot of frameworks, but just know that you have access to that is the important thing. Okay, and then some other examples of research questions for systematic reviews. What are systematic reviews specifically? Really well designed to answer. And again, is a specific intervention effective? And how do two interventions compare? That's what we just talked about. Experiences of patients or, you know, a population. What is the experience with a specific intervention? Again, we're still really narrow with that specific intervention. And then prevalence of a specific condition. So very narrow. Also accuracy, test accuracies. And so that is, you know, a lot of the health sciences and even like the psychology, the tests they're using to measure things. How accurate are those? And so systematic reviews are really good at determining how effective a specific test is for measuring whatever your phenomenon is. Risk factors is another good one. Prognosis of a condition, and then research methods. Is a research method, this is very similar to that test or measure, whether they're accurate. Is a research method really accurate for, really good for what you're wanting? As opposed to scoping reviews. These are going to be much broader, right? So what has been done? Where are the gaps in the literature? What populations have been included? What progress has been made in research? Lots of trends, so policy changes, timelines. Scoping reviews are really, really good for looking at trends. and mapping like key concepts. So the mapping types of questions. How is research conducted? And does enough literature exist to conduct a systematic review? Or, does this tell you, oh, okay, this research doesn't exist, so now this is going to inform my next study. I know that now I want to do this with these parameters because this is what the literature says, and here's this gap in this literature. So while scoping reviews can be really good for doing things like mapping trends and can be really good in their own right, they can also be very, very good for informing future research. And that is one of the huge strengths of scoping reviews. And I think that's one of those things where sort of we were talking earlier, before the recording about, scoping reviews can sometimes be seen as not as important or not as rigorous or whatever, not as respected as things like systematic reviews or other studies. And I really wish that we could sort of change that narrative a little bit, because a lot of this it still might be sort of background research, but it is essential background research for helping science progress in a way that is building on things and that has integrity as we're going. So again, scoping review geek. I will always push scoping reviews. I love them. I think they're so important for advancing our knowledge. Okay, and then another thing, this is basically just a plug. So as you're developing your research question, as you're thinking through which methodology, really look into that methodology and see if it is designed to answer the research question, and be very transparent about that in your papers. And with systematic reviews and scoping reviews, you're kind of required to, but I would really recommend in any of your papers that you're doing, cite your methodology and define it, right? So and also put your research question in your paper so that it is there, it is upfront. We know what we're trying to answer by reading your paper. You've done this work, you've developed a really strong research question, just stick it in there as is, so that we know as we're reading through. And then also it helps, peer reviewers say, oh, okay, this method actually did answer the research question that you were asking. Or maybe it didn't, and maybe we need to rethink this, right? So just a plug for being transparent about those things.